The clink of a fork against porcelain was a gunshot in the symphony of quiet dining. Chloe flinched, her shoulders tightening under the stiff fabric of her uniform. She kept her eyes down, focused on the polished silver she was arranging at an empty table, the soft wool of the tablecloth a small comfort against her fingertips. The restaurant was a world of hushed tones and expensive tastes, a place where men in sharp suits made quiet deals over seared scallops and women with jewels dripping from their ears laughed without making a sound. Chloe moved through it like a ghost, a 19-year-old girl trying to be invisible, trying to earn enough to make her real life, the one outside these walls, a little less precarious. Her manager, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, gestured her over to the corner booth, the one reserved for their most important clientele. Table 7, Chloe. Be quick, be quiet, be perfect. She nodded, grabbing her notepad. As she approached, the temperature seemed to drop. 3 men sat in the booth, all wearing suits so dark they seemed to absorb the low, ambient light. But it was the man in the center who held the room captive without a word. He wasn't the loudest or the largest, but he possessed a gravitational stillness that bent the space around him. His suit was a deep charcoal, tailored with a precision that suggested it was made for his body and no other. His hands rested on the table, one on either side of a water glass, perfectly still. They were elegant hands with long fingers, but they looked like they could break things without effort. That was the moment she made the mistake of looking up, past the hands, past the stark white collar of his shirt, and into his eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. Beside him sat a small, elderly woman, her back ramrod straight, her hair a perfect silver helmet. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll, but her eyes, so much like the man's, missed nothing. She surveyed the restaurant with a look of profound disapproval. Chloe kept her voice low, a soft murmur that was practiced and professional. "Good evening. May I get you started with something to drink?" One of the flanking men spoke for the table, ordering bottled water, no ice. The man in the center, the one with the dangerous hands, never looked at her. He spoke in Korean to the elderly woman, his voice a low, smooth baritone that was at odds with the tension coiling in his shoulders. The woman replied, her tone sharp and clipped. An argument, Chloe realized, her stomach twisting. It was a language she knew too well, a language that belonged to a different part of her life. She kept locked away. The first courses arrived. The woman picked at her salad, her lips pressed into a thin, unhappy line. She said something else in Korean, her voice rising slightly. The man's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing just below his ear. He replied in that same low tone, a clear command for quiet. The manager scurried over. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Kwan?" The man, Mr. Kwan, finally moved his head. The small motion was electric. "My mother requires a different dressing for her salad. Something less American." The manager's professional smile faltered. "Of course, sir. What kind of dressing would she prefer?" Mr. Kwan turned to his mother and asked. She launched into a rapid, detailed explanation, her hands gesturing. She spoke in a thick, country dialect, full of textures and rhythms that were a world away from the crisp, formal Korean spoken in Seoul's business districts. It was the language of her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of home. The manager looked at Mr. Kwan, his face a mask of polite panic. Mr. Kwan's own expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of something, frustration, maybe even helplessness, crossed his face as he tried and failed to translate the nuances of his mother's request. He knew the words, but not the music. "She wants," he began, then stopped. "It doesn't matter. This is fine." His mother slammed her fork down. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. She spoke again, her voice shaking with indignation, looking directly at Chloe. She was complaining about the bland food, the cold service, the son who would drag her to such a soulless place. And Chloe understood every single word. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to melt back into the shadows. This was not her business. This man was not someone whose attention she wanted. But then she looked at the old woman's face, at the frustration and loneliness warring in her eyes, and something inside Chloe broke. It was the echo of her own grandmother, trying to navigate a world that refused to speak her language. Taking a breath that didn't feel like enough, Chloe turned to the woman. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect that was as ingrained as breathing. And then she spoke, in the same rich, rural dialect. "Forgive the interruption, madam," Chloe said, her Korean flowing out of her, soft and certain. "The chef has a wonderful sesame and perilla oil dressing he can prepare. It is not on the menu. It is very light, very traditional. Would that be more to your liking?" The world stopped. The old woman's eyes widened, her mouth falling slightly open. The two men flanking Mr. Kwon froze, their professional composure shattered. The manager looked like he was about to faint. But Chloe only saw Kwon Jihan. He had turned his head fully toward her. The stillness was gone, replaced by an intensity that felt like a physical blow. His dark eyes weren't just looking at her. They were dissecting her, peeling back the layers of her cheap uniform, her practiced shyness, searching for the source of this impossible anomaly. The room was silent, but in his gaze, Chloe heard a door slam shut, locking her in. His mother, recovering, beamed. She clapped her hands together and chattered at Chloe, delighted. Chloe answered politely, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt Jihan's stare on her, a weight she could not shrug off. He let his mother talk for another minute before he raised a single, calm hand. The torrent of words stopped. In perfect, unaccented English, his voice like cold silk, he spoke to Chloe. But his words were for the entire room. "Everyone leave us." The manager and the other servers evaporated. His own men hesitated for a fraction of a second before he gave them a look that was as good as a blade. They rose and retreated to a discreet distance. It was just the three of them, his mother beaming, him watching her with predatory focus, and Chloe standing in the wreckage of her own invisibility. "Sit," he commanded. It was not a request. Her legs felt weak, but she sank into the empty seat across from him. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. That was the moment everything changed. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a secret he had just discovered, and he was not the kind of man who left secrets unattended. He did not fire her. He did not cause a scene. He simply paid his bill, an amount that would cover her rent for 6 months, and waited for her shift to end. He waited in a black sedan with windows so dark they reflected the streetlights like obsidian mirrors. One of his men, the one with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, met her at the employee exit. "Mr. Kwon requires your services," the man said, his voice flat. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Chloe said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "I'm just a waitress." "Not anymore," the man replied, and held the car door open. It was an invitation that felt like a verdict. She was taken to a penthouse that scraped the sky, a place of glass and steel and minimalist furniture that cost more than her car. It was beautiful and sterile, a luxurious prison. Kwon Jihan was there, standing before a floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles. He had changed from his suit into a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers. The casual attire did nothing to soften him. "My mother was impressed," he said, without turning around. "She has not spoken that freely to a stranger in a decade. She reminded me of my grandmother," Chloe whispered to the silent room. He turned then. "Your grandmother is from Jeolla province." Chloe froze. He had not just recognized the language, he had placed its origin with surgical precision. "My mother was adopted. She was taught by her foster mother, who was from there, a half-truth. The simplest explanation. You will be my mother's companion," he stated. "You will accompany her during the day. You will speak with her. You will be compensated beyond what you could ever make at that restaurant." "I can't," she said, the words feeling flimsy and useless. "I have a life. School. Your tuition will be paid. Your apartment lease will be terminated and your belongings moved to a suite here. In this building," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is not a negotiation. You have a skill I require. More than that, you have information. You know my mother's dialect. You know her home. That makes you a liability I must control. It is better for you to be controlled with comfort than without it." And so her life was dismantled and reassembled into a shape she didn't recognize. Her days were spent with Mrs. Kwon, a woman who blossomed under the simple gift of conversation. They walked through botanical gardens, visited museums, and sat in the quiet of the penthouse, drinking tea. Chloe learned that Mrs. Kwan was sharp, funny, and deeply lonely. She also learned about her son. She spoke of Jihan as a boy, serious and watchful even then. She spoke of his father, a man of immense power and uncompromising will, who was murdered in a betrayal that shattered their family. Jihan was never the same, she said one afternoon, her gaze distant. He promised me that day. He promised he would build an empire so strong that no one could ever touch us again. He promised I would always be safe, she sighed, a small, sad sound. He built his fortress, but he locked himself inside it. And me with him. In that moment, Chloe saw it. Jihan's wound. It wasn't just about power or money. It was about this small, fierce woman. His entire world, this cold, violent empire he commanded, was a fortress built around her. And her isolation, her inability to connect with the world he had placed her in, was a constant, grating reminder of his failure. He could give her anything but the one thing she craved, a voice. Chloe had given her that. The danger, when it came, was quiet at first. A black car that seemed to be in their rearview mirror too often. A man at a cafe whose eyes lingered on them for too long. Chloe felt it as a prickle on her skin, a shift in the atmosphere. Jihan's men, always a discreet presence, became a solid wall around them. One afternoon, as they left a gallery, the black car reappeared, pulling up beside them with a screech of tires. Two men got out. They weren't dressed in suits. They were rough, their intentions ugly and clear. Jihan's driver barked something into a radio, while his bodyguard moved to shield Mrs. Kwan and Chloe. Chloe saw the raw fear in Mrs. Kwan's eyes. She grabbed the old woman's hand, her own heart pounding. "It's all right," she said in Korean. "Stay with me. Look at me." The bodyguard was good, but it was 2 against 1. A side door to the gallery was still open a few feet away. Chaos was their only chance. While the bodyguard engaged the first man, the second lunged for Mrs. Kwan. Without thinking, Chloe acted. She shoved Mrs. Kwan toward the open gallery door, screaming, "Go, now." Then she did something stupid and brave. She threw her purse, heavy with a book and a water bottle, directly at the second man's face. It was a pathetic defense, but it was enough. The man stumbled back, surprised, his attention diverted for a critical second. That second was all Jihan needed. His car came out of nowhere, mounting the curb and pinning the second attacker against the wall with a sickening crunch of metal and bone. Jihan was out of the driver's side before the engine died, moving with a speed and grace that was terrifying. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, but he didn't need one. He disabled the first man with a series of short, brutal strikes that were too fast to follow. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The street was suddenly silent, save for the groans of the two men on the ground and the ticking of Jihan's cooling engine. He walked over to them, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes scanned his mother first, ensuring she was unharmed. Then they landed on Chloe. He saw her, trembling but upright, still standing between his mother and the memory of the threat. That night, she found a packed bag in her room and a plane ticket on her bed. A one-way flight to anywhere she wanted to go. A severance package that would let her live comfortably for years. It was her chance. Her way out. She could take it and never look back, disappearing from this violent world forever. She stood in the hallway, bag in hand, her heart a tangled knot of fear and something else, something she didn't want to name. She could hear Mrs. Kwan in the living room, her voice a low, frightened murmur on the phone. She was talking to Jihan. Chloe walked not to the elevator, but to the living room. Mrs. Kwan saw her and her face fell. She thought Chloe was leaving. Chloe put her bag down. She went into the kitchen, made a pot of the barley tea Mrs. Kwan loved, and brought it to her. She sat with her, not saying a word, until the old woman's trembling stopped. She had made her choice. Later, Jihan found her on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. He had a small, clean cut across his knuckles, the only visible sign of the afternoon's violence. "You should have left," he said. His voice was rough. "Your mother was scared," Chloe replied, not looking at him. You were scared. Yes, she admitted. I was. He came to stand beside her, his presence a solid warmth in the cool night air. He held out his hand. She looked at it, then back at him. It needs to be cleaned, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She led him inside, to the cold marble of the guest bathroom. She found the first aid kit, her hands moving with a purpose she didn't feel. She was a waitress, a student. She was not equipped for this. But her hands were steady as she cleaned the cut, dabbing it with antiseptic. His skin was warm. He didn't flinch, just watched her, his gaze intense and unnervingly focused. Her fingers brushed against his. A jolt, small and sharp, went through her. She looked up and their eyes met. The space between them shrank, filled with the sterile smell of antiseptic and something else, something primal and unspoken. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged with the violence of the day, with her decision to stay, with his silent, shocked acknowledgement of it. He saw her, really saw her, not as an employee, not as a liability, but as someone who hadn't run. And in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something that looked terrifyingly like possession. Her new life had a rhythm. Days with Mrs. Kwan, evenings in the silent, cavernous penthouse. Jihan was a ghost, a presence she felt more than saw. He came and went at odd hours, his suits always immaculate, his face a carefully blank mask. But Chloe started noticing things. The way his eyes would find her the moment he entered a room. The way he started leaving books on the coffee table, poetry, history, novels, things he thought she might like. Small, almost deniable gestures of something. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself wandering the silent apartment. A door she'd always assumed was a closet was slightly ajar. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse in this house, pulled her in. It was his office. A massive desk of dark wood dominated the room, one wall lined with books, another with a stark, modern painting. On his desk, under the soft glow of a single lamp, lay a file. It was open. She knew she shouldn't look. It was a violation, a line she shouldn't cross. But she was already in his world. She might as well know the laws that governed it. The file contained surveillance photos and reports. The target was a man she recognized from the news, a city councilman who had been a vocal opponent of a new waterfront development project. The final page was a single sheet with a photograph of the man's family, his wife, his 2 young children, and a handwritten note at the bottom. Leverage. The councilman had withdrawn his opposition 2 days ago, citing unexpected personal reasons. A cold dread washed over her. This wasn't abstract danger. This was cold, calculated cruelty. This was the man who chose books for her, the man whose wounded hand she had cleaned. He did not just command violence, he wielded lives like chess pieces. She backed out of the room, her heart a block of ice in her chest. The knowledge of it sat inside her, a toxic secret. The enemy, a rival faction led by a man named Choi, was not deterred by the failed abduction. They were emboldened. They saw Jihan's reaction, the uncharacteristic fury, and understood they had found his weakness. The threat escalated. It was no longer just about his mother. It was about the quiet American girl who was always by her side. The attack came on a Tuesday. They were at a small, private nursery helping Mrs. Kwan pick out orchids. The afternoon was peaceful, sun-drenched. The trap was perfectly laid. Their usual security team was taken out silently, replaced by Choi's men. Chloe only realized something was wrong when she saw their driver's reflection in the glass of the greenhouse, his face grim, his hand inside his jacket. He wasn't their driver. He moved toward Mrs. Kwan. Chloe reacted on instinct. She grabbed a heavy ceramic pot and hurled it, not at the man, but at the sprawling glass panels of the greenhouse wall. The sound of shattering glass was an explosion. It was the alarm Jihan would hear. Chaos erupted. One of the men grabbed Chloe, his arm a band of steel around her throat. She could see Mrs. Kwan being dragged away by 2 others. For a terrible, paralyzing moment, she thought this was it. Jihan would be too late. He would lose his mother. He would lose her. But then she remembered the file. The councilman. The leverage. Jihan's methods were brutal, but they were a language. Maybe it was one she could speak. Stop, she choked out, the words tearing at her throat. Choi doesn't want her. He wants the port contracts. The man holding her paused. What do you know about that? Jihan will burn this entire city to the ground for his mother, she gasped, her mind racing, pulling together fragments of conversations she'd overheard. He'll destroy the contracts, give them to the triads, anything to spite Choi. You'll get nothing. But me? I'm his new liability. I'm the leverage. It was a wild, desperate gamble. She was making herself the target, betting her life on the cold logic of men who saw people as assets. The man holding her exchanged a look with the others. He saw the truth in her desperate lie. A frightened old woman was a symbol. The boss's new girl was a bargaining chip. He shoved her forward. Take the girl. Leave the old woman. It was the most terrifying moment of her life, watching them leave Mrs. Kwan behind, sobbing but safe, as she was dragged into darkness. She had crossed a line. She had used his brutal calculus against his enemies. She was no longer just a witness to his world. She was a participant. The aftermath was a blur of fear and disorientation. She was held in a cold, damp warehouse, the smell of salt and decay thick in the air. But her gambit had worked. It had bought time. Time for Jihan. When he came, it was not with sirens and flashing lights. It was with a sudden, deadly silence. The sounds of struggle outside were brief and final. The door to the room she was in splintered open, and he was there, a silhouette against the harsh light. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were burning. The air thrummed with tension. They were alone now, in the quiet of a safe house, the city a distant, muffled hum. Adrenaline still sang in her veins. He hadn't said a word to her since he'd pulled her from that warehouse. He had simply held her arm, his grip bruisingly tight, and led her away. Now, he stood across from her, his jacket gone, his white shirt stark in the dim light. There was a darkness in his eyes she had never seen before, a terrifying storm of relief and rage. That was a foolish risk, he said, his voice dangerously low. It worked, she countered, her own voice trembling but defiant. Your mother is safe. At your expense, he took a step closer. You offered yourself to them. You made yourself the target. I used what I've learned from you. She shot back, the toxic knowledge from his office file burning on her tongue. Leverage. The word hung in the air between them. Ugly and true. His mask finally cracked. A muscle in his jaw jumped. He saw that she understood, that she had looked into the abyss of who he was and had not only refused to run, but had learned its language. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle against her skin. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. My mother, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't conceal, has not smiled, truly smiled, since my father died. Not until you came, he paused, his gaze searching hers. You brought light back into her life. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something heavier. An admission of debt. A confession of need. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. I told myself I stayed for her, Chloe whispered, the confession tearing from her own heart. I'm not sure that's the only reason anymore. The admission hung between them, a dangerous, fragile truth. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. She could feel his breath on her lips, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin mixed with the metallic tang of the night's violence. It was a claim, silent and absolute. He was not going to let her go. And she, God help her, did not want to leave. Choi was not a man who accepted defeat. Losing Chloe, losing the leverage she represented, was a public humiliation. The message came the next day. It was a small, ornate box delivered to the penthouse. Inside, on a bed of black silk, was a single, dead orchid, the same kind Mrs. Kwan had been admiring at the nursery. Tucked beneath it was a photograph of Chloe, taken from a distance, as she entered the restaurant where she used to work. The message was clear. We know who she is. We know where she came from. There is nowhere she is safe from us. The war was no longer for territory. It was for her. Jihan's response was not to hide her. It was to end the threat. The city held its breath as 2 underworld powers prepared for a final confrontation. Chloe was moved to a new location, a stark, modern house perched in the hills, a fortress of concrete and glass. She was a queen in a gilded cage, the object of a war she never wanted. But she refused to be a passive prize. She spent her time observing, listening. She learned the rhythms of Jihan's security, the names of his top lieutenants, the codes they used. She had become a part of his world, and she would use its rules to survive. The final confrontation was orchestrated by Choi. He leaked a location, a supposed meeting for a truce, knowing Jihan would see it as the trap it was. But it was a double trap. While Jihan's forces prepared to assault the primary location, a smaller team was dispatched to the safe house in the hills. They knew Jihan would leave her with a skeleton crew, believing she was far from the action. They were right. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. The few guards were overwhelmed. Chloe found herself cornered in the master bedroom, the sounds of fighting echoing from downstairs. The door burst open. Two of Choi's men stood there, guns raised. They thought she was just a waitress. They thought she was a frightened girl. They were wrong. As they advanced, she spoke, her voice clear and steady, in the Korean dialect Jihan's mother had taught her. Choi is dead. The men froze. Confusion warred with aggression on their faces. Jihan's men took him an hour ago, she lied, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. She was channeling Jihan's own brand of cold authority. The truce was the trap, but it was Jihan's trap. Your organization is collapsing as we speak. Your lieutenants are already cutting deals. Whose deal are you? She had seen how Jihan controlled people, not just with violence but with information, with the illusion of inevitability. She was betting everything on their fear and self-preservation. One of the men wavered, his gun lowering slightly. That was the opening. Not for her to fight, but for Jihan. He appeared in the doorway behind them, a wraith in the shadows. He moved with the lethal silence she now knew so well. It was over before the men could process the truth of her lie. In the aftermath, the room was still, the only sound their ragged breathing. Jihan walked toward her, his eyes sweeping over her, checking for injuries. He stopped just before her, his face a mixture of fury, awe, and a fierce, raw possession that made her breath catch. He reached out, not to touch her face, but to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. You are not leaving, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Not my mother. Not me. This is your place now. He was claiming her here, in a room that smelled of gunpowder and fear. And she did not resist. The cost of this victory was clear. She could never go back to her old life. She had seen the full, monstrous extent of his power, and she had used its shadow to protect herself. Her innocence was gone, replaced by a chilling competence. And he, in turn, had to accept that she had seen the very worst of him and had not only stayed, but had fought back using his own dark arts. Later, she stood by the vast window, looking down at the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. It was his empire, built of secrets and blood. He came to stand behind her, his presence a familiar weight, a promise, a cage she no longer wanted to flee. She saw their reflections in the glass, two figures framed against the sprawling darkness. She had made a choice in that gallery, the choice to stay. Now she made another, to own it. This violent, dangerous world was her reality now. And in the center of it, she was the one thing its king would burn it all down to protect. A heart that now beat in time with the city's lethal rhythm.